How democratic is the EU? After the Second World War, the European Economic Community was established. The idea was to foster economic cooperation. Countries that trade with one another would become economically interdependent and more likely to avoid conflict. This became the EU in 1993. However, the recent Eurozone crisis has heightened the issue of the EU's legitimacy among its member state populations. The forthcoming UK referendum brings this all to a head. Many argue the EU is undemocratic and needs severe reform. Research shows the EU is becoming more democratic. Representation is increasing. But it's about more than this. Participation in EU elections is declining. The refugee and Eurozone crisis raise questions about problem solving, and people do not feel European. Democracy. Research says that any democracy needs representation, and the EU is no exception. Representation in the EU is gradually increasing. Elected governments have a seat at the table of the European Council, giving states representation on decisions about EU strategic priorities, and in the Council of Ministers, which approves legislation proposed by the Commission and also approved by the European Parliament. The Parliament represents voters through elected MPs from each member state. New members are elected via proportional representation every 5 years. In 2014, for the first time, the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, was the chosen candidate of the European People's Party, the largest party in the European elections. There's also the European Citizens Initiative, which enables citizens to call directly on the Commission to propose new laws if they get 1 million signatures. But representation may not be enough for EU democracy to work. Research shows a legitimate political community needs 3 things: public participation, ability to solve problems, and common identification. Participation. Average turnout in EP elections has declined every year since the first elections in 1979, from 62% to the lowest level of 42.6% in 2014. Research says this lack of participation is a real problem for the EU's long-term legitimacy. Problem solving. Research says the EU's legitimacy is also based on the ability to solve long-term problems affecting Europe. The common market promotes economic growth through free trade. Medicines, foods, drugs, and even aeroplanes are checked for quality by expert agencies. Member states work together on reducing pollution and improving transport safety. But the recent refugee and Eurozone crisis have challenged this effectiveness. Research shows these problems are getting more difficult to deal with. Identity. Thirdly, research shows it is important that people identify as European and debate European issues for the EU to thrive as a democratic organisation. To foster identity across the Union, EU citizens are guaranteed the same fundamental rights to travel and work free from discrimination. But this has not led to people feeling more European. In 2015, the EU's own survey showed only 8% of people across Europe felt they were European in some way. Research shows people have been debating European issues recently, but this has been in a negative light, focusing on the Eurozone and refugee crisis. Conclusion. Ultimately, research tells us the EU is democratizing, but it faces challenges. Participation in European elections is decreasing, crises are erupting, and people do not feel European. It suggests the future of the EU depends not just on improving representation, but stimulating participation in elections, delivering solutions to common problems, and improving deliberation about European identity.